Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Student Spotlight series, where we showcase some of the work our past students have done. So today it is our pleasure to have with us Chaeeun Jung. So Chaeeun, can you tell us a bit about yourself, where you're from, what year of school you're in, and what course you took with CCIR?
Hello, my name is Chaeeun, and I'm from Korea. I'm currently a sophomore in high school, and I joined the CCIR 101 research program with Dr. Sunvay Lim from University of Cambridge.
So can you say how you became interested in the program?
Um, so my topic was the conceptual misapplication of addiction theory to social media use. And since social media is a really big part of life for everyone, especially in my generations, and as someone who is deeply engaged with social media every day, I really wanted to connect it to the matter that is deeply associated with our generation and the societal structure that is beginning to form with the access to new entertainments and medias. And through writing a research paper, I not only wanted to share my insights, but also challenge myself to discover how deeply I can immerse myself into a project and push my own understandings beyond the surface. I liked that the CCIR program encouraged students to investigate on real world issues through evidence-based research. And since my topic combines psychology, neuroscience, and digital technology, I really wanted a program that would allow me to critically evaluate the existing literatures rather than just summarizing the information. And by that means, I wanted to examine methodologies, distinguish correlations from causations, and assess whether my findings were strong enough to support a framework.
Okay, cool. Yeah, really interesting topic. So was that a topic that you had in mind prior to starting the program? Or I guess, did you develop that in any way with your mentor?
I think it was along the structure of the course. In the first, when I applied, I didn't have a very defined research paper in mind. I did have a root curiosity about dopamines derived from problematic social media use and its biological impacts. That was what I wrote in my personal statements. But even at that time, I didn't have a strong knowledge about neuroscience and reward systems. So the first few meetings with my mentor, we kind of shaped the structure of the real research that we are going to do. We looked at what the neurobiological terms like dopamine actually was and the process behind activating our reward systems. And we discussed a lot about addiction criteria, how people define addictions, which was not simple. And over the next following meetings, we looked at several related researches at different criterias. And overall, yeah, I developed the topic with my mentor together.
So you mentioned that I guess, that you wanted to develop your own framework for looking at the topic. Can you say a little bit more about that? Like, what was your methodology? How did you approach? You said you engaged in a critique of the existing literature. How did you, I guess, develop or approach that critique?
Um, So the structure of the research paper itself, I did a literature review on several original research papers with the experiments from other researchers, and I looked at their methodologies, their research styles. So I kind of picked up the evidences that can be used for my own researches. So by that means, I am not just summarizing the information in the research itself, but I am critically evaluating the research and extracting information that is really needed for my research itself. And that was what I meant by the methodology.
So I guess where do you feel like I guess your own paper falls within the existing literature? I mean, what are the sort of major views that you're engaging with, and maybe are there ones that you end up sort of agreeing with, or is there a certain, I guess, way of looking at the issue that you're specifically trying to criticize?
Um, my research paper does not have a really clear, um, I would say like defined yes or no. It has a list of not a list, a several findings from one perspective and another perspective. So social media So one of my biggest findings for my paper was that symptoms people often use to describe social media addiction do not consistently, um, but that means it's not always or it's never, so match the clinical definition of addiction used in psychology. So like in true addictions like substance use or gambling disorders, there are clear patterns of like impaired control or like withdrawal tolerance symptoms. But in this literature review, I found that these features were either weak or inconsistent with the problematic social media use.
So why do you think it is then that I guess so much of the literature out there and also just in pop culture, people are so quick to apply the label of addiction to social media use?
Um, I would say s- I think it is because it looks like an addiction. And what I mean by that, so in the beginning, I mentioned that social media addiction can be misleading, and I think it is misleading because it implies that excessive social media use functions as the same way as the clinically recognized addictions like substance abuse or gambling disorders. But the evidence does not consistently support that comparison. So, in true addictions, people often show severe impairments in executive controls and clinically and show significant withdrawal symptoms, which in the research I reviewed, these features were, as I said, inconsistent. So, um, yeah, just because it is excessively used does not necessarily mean it is addiction, and just because it is addiction does not mean it is necessarily harmful. So, um, what I found interesting was that many users still maintain their normal decision-making abilities and social functionings while still having high screen time. So, um, the symptoms often really overlapped more strongly with their emotional coping rather than a distinct addictive disorder.
So when you say that the symptoms overlap with emotional coping, I guess that seems like it could mean a lot of different things. Does it, I guess, do you mean by that that the symptoms that we associate with, I guess, a dysfunctional relationship to social media, I guess, stem from maybe conditions that are individual to, I guess, to the person in question? Or do you think that that all the different things that we talk about, sort of in terms of social media addiction, maybe erroneously, do still refer to one type of disorder?
Um,
Let me clarify. That question was a little bit loose. I guess I mean people talk about social media addiction all the time. When they're talking about that, I guess clearly you're suggesting that they're not speaking accurately, that it's not really an addiction. So what are
mhm.
people talking about then? Are they talking about one thing that we need to define differently, or are they talking about lumping a variety of different things maybe under one umbrella?
Um, I mean, the social media addiction is not a really recognized term, but the main goal was to really highlight that it's important that we label a problem that affects how we understand it, and, like since it affects how we understand it and respond to it. So if we immediately label social media use as an addiction, we really risk oversimplifying behaviors or overlook its root cause. So especially when using an addiction label, it can influence other treatment approaches. So, like, for example, when we assume that problematic social media use is purely an addiction, the solutions may really solely focus on restricting the screen time rather than addressing the really emotional or social root causes that underlies in the behavior. Um, and since social media is deeply integrated within our daily lives for communications, educations, and other relationships, unlike substances such as drugs or alcohols. Treating it like an addiction could really pathologize normal behaviors and create unnecessary stigma around common digital habits. Um, Especially since addiction is a really serious clinical disorder with a specific diagnostic criteria, applying the term can be too broad and blur the distinctions between the genuine addiction and normal but high engagement everyday activities. So rather than putting it in one big umbrella, I think it is important to look at individual aspects, individual patterns of behaviors to really see the root causes of different symptoms that individuals outcome.
So I'm curious then, is that so that seems to be your main finding? Were there any sort of, I guess, I guess secondary findings that you had also along the way that were particularly interesting to you?
The secondary findings were the gap in the current researches. So, uh, while researching this topic, I found that there's a really big gap in this field with the issue of causality. Most current research is correlational, which means that it shows the association between social media use and a psychological distress, but it cannot really determine whether social media causes those problems or whether individuals who already are experiencing the negative symptoms like anxiety, loneliness, or depressions are more likely to engage with heavy social media use as a coping mechanism. Um, and another major gap is like difficulty in distinguishing high engagements from genuinely problematic use. So in modern society, high social media use is really normalized, especially among adolescents. So screen time alone is not a reliable indicator of the dysfunctions. So in the future researches, I think we need to identify a really clear qualitative differences between the healthy engagements and maladaptive patterns of use. S- uh, yeah.
So, do you have any thoughts then about what, I mean, I guess this would be sort of a direction for future research maybe, but do you have any thoughts about what maybe better language for talking about dysfunctional use of social media and what might be, or what better criteria for evaluating whether someone's use of social media is healthy might be?
Um, I think addiction framework can be used to some degree. So, in the beginning, me and my professor was discussing the distinction between habits and addictions. So, and we came to a conclusion that habit is more like a repetitive act out of familiarity or a pattern, whereas addiction it has a aspects that is an aspect that has become necessary and it impacts our daily lives. So it is kind of like a chronic disorder that we compulsively engage in, um, despite being aware of the harmful consequences. So to determine whether the social media use, um, at the moment is really problematic or not is to see if it impacts our daily lives, to see if whether we are aware of the harmful consequences and still compulsively engage with it. Um, I think that is one of the ways that we can determine problematic social media use rather than labeling them as an addiction.
So earlier you also spoke, I mean, I guess in general terms, of social media, about social media as an issue that particularly faces your generation, or in general, I guess younger, younger people. Did your research change your evaluation of, I guess, social media as a, I guess, as a phenomenon in general? Do you have a more positive or a less positive view of it? Do you think it's more of a problem than you did before, or less of a problem?
Um, to be honest, I think social media is uh, less of a problem. And what I mean by that is I don't mean that social media is not harmful at all. Uh, But I'm just saying that one of the key points of my paper is that rejecting addiction label does not necessarily mean dismissing the negative effects of the excessive social media use. So, social media use can absolutely contribute to problems like, sleep deprivations, reduced productivity in daily lives, or like emotional dependence. But as I said before, harm alone does not automatically equal addiction, and addiction does not equal harm. So many behaviors can become unhealthy or maladaptive without meeting the criteria for a clinical disorder. So what I wanted to say is that of course, we need to be careful not to oversimplify these issues by labeling everything addictive. So, um, I think it would be better to understand social media use through factors like emotional regulations or um, platform designs itself, like algorithms, to provide more effective ways to address problematic social media use rather than solely relying on addiction framework and intensifying its definition.
Yeah, I mean, this seems like a very wise approach to me. I think that it's clearly it's very important to speak with precision. And I think often when we mislabel something and then I guess apply a framework to thinking about it that's not actually really adequate to the thing itself, um, then I mean, if we do that, then how would we ever actually address the real issue? So I think that's a really interesting conclusion. Were there any other things that you found surprising or particularly interesting in your research?
Mm, While researching the cognitive aspects, it was really interesting to see that individuals typically show attentional bias, um, and impaired decision making. But like studies I reviewed found that problematic social media users generally retained their normal cognitive functionings. Like social media cues did not automatically capture attention the way addiction-related cues do in substance use. So, like heavy Facebook users still demonstrated normal learning and risk evaluation abilities, and that finding was really significant, especially in my research, because it showed that addiction usually disrupts the value-based decision making, but it showed that heavy social media users retain those abilities instead.
Yeah, that seems like a really helpful and clear kind of line in the sand that you can draw between, I guess, dysfunctional social media, or not even dysfunctional necessarily, but heavy social media use and addiction. So have you finished writing your paper?
Yes, I finished writing this paper and recently I've published it in the OJSS.
Oh, that's great. Congratulations. Can you say a bit about the process of working on your paper with your mentor? I guess what kind of support did you receive in that process? I mean, what parts of it were maybe especially helpful, or maybe were there parts that were especially difficult?
Um, I think one of the most valuable aspects of the CCIR program was that it introduced me to the actual process of academic research rather than just teaching the content itself. So, through this program, I learned how to evaluate sources critically, like I mentioned before, analyze methodologies, and synthesize evidences across really multiple disciplines um, uh, and like construct my own opinions and own arguments based on the empirical findings um, rather than following other researchers. And beyond the finding itself, it really helped me with my academic writing skills. So I had to move beyond summarizing studies and instead really evaluate the strength of each evidences and identify its limitations to really examine the contradictions within the literature. So I think that process really prepared me well for the future researches because it taught me how the academic inquiry is built through a lot of questionings and interpretations with based reasonings.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway to have. I feel like those skills are often very difficult to learn, even in college. I think unless you seek out that kind of training, sometimes you end up not receiving it. So I think yeah, that's a very valuable experience. Um, do you have any advice maybe that you would give someone who's going to start a similar program, or is there anything that you wish that you had known before starting yourself?
Um, I wish I had known earlier that a strong research is not only about proving your original opinion correct. So at the beginning, I honestly approached the topic thinking that I would really fully confirm or completely reject the idea of social media addiction. But like as I went deeper into a literature, I realized that really strong research is more about engaging with the complexity and evaluating these evidences with while being open to nuance. So some of the findings supported the aspect of addiction framework, while others strongly contradicted it. So learning how to handle conflicting evidences really became important part of the process. So, um, my biggest advice would be to choose a topic that you are genuinely interested or curious about because it involves spending a lot of time thinking deeply about one issue, and curiosity makes the process much more enjoyable and helps you stay motivated when the work becomes challenging. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very wise conclusion to draw about research. Though unfortunately, I think that even like that pressure to have sort of a very distinct result never quite goes away. I mean, there's a whole uh, issue in the sciences with people often getting null results, and then you can't really publish a null result. But that's important, as you said, that like even if you don't necessarily clearly prove your hypothesis correct or even false necessarily, the process through which you do that actually does matter, even though maybe it's not so glamorous. And
Hmm.
yeah, obviously, it is so important to choose a topic that you actually like because you're going to spend a lot of time working on it. Um, I feel like a common experience that I feel like people have during their like PhDs, for example, is you work on the same topic for years and years, and by the end, almost everybody hates their topic.
Yeah.
So if you didn't really love it originally, then like if you start to hate it right at the end, that's okay. It's important to love what you do enough that you can go maybe at least like 2 or 3 years without starting to hate it. So yeah, that's good advice. Do you have any other thoughts you'd like to share about your experience before we go?
Um, I found it interesting that the academic research papers, especially like related to neuroscience researches, I initially expected it to be really inaccessible. But at first, some of the terminologies and methodologies felt intimidating, but over time, it became more comfortable to interpret these studies and identify like the main arguments. So, I realized that understanding the research is more like a gradual process. And once I really learned the core concepts, reading these literatures became much more manageable and even sometimes enjoyable.
Yeah, I think that's also a good observation. I think sometimes people are too daunted by the prospect of like reading scientific papers, but really it is something that a vocabulary that you can pick up relatively quickly. And even if you can't necessarily understand like all the technical details, if you can grasp the main argument, I mean that's pretty good and that's very useful. Um, anyway, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us about your experience and your paper. It was interesting, and I think maybe I sort of, without much thought, have used sort of the language of addiction when talking about social media before. But yeah, I think you make a solid case that that's um, I guess that's incorrect, and I will be more thoughtful in the future. So
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, it was really nice talking to you and learning about your work. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.